Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. And as we have heard that the Liberal government is passing a bill that would ban and cap licensing on handguns, and of course, it's assault weapons and weapons like the AR-15 have already been banned, and they're also putting a cap on the maximum size of a magazine that can be loaded into a handgun or a rifle. With that announcement, the conservatives are being extremely critical about what is actually going on with that. While bans are nice because those who obey the rules will follow the rules, and they won't do anything to modify any of the firearms that they have in their possession, and that they will say the rules are the rules and live by them. But gun violence in general is not being committed by those who will follow the rules to begin with. Gun violence is committed by those who are willing to break the rules, that they may have no regard for the rules. And this is the point that the Conservative Party is bringing up with the announcement of the bill C-11 over the limitations to firearms. What are the tools that are going to be provided to law enforcement? What are the tools that are going to be provided to the courts in order to assure that those who are wanting to break the rules will be found, tried, and imprisoned until they decide to follow the rules? What are the penalties going to be, and how are those penalties going to be upheld for breaking the firearm rules? That is something that maybe the Liberal government has not really addressed, and it needs to be addressed in order to prevent some of the gun violence that we're actually seeing. Along with that, the conservative MP that we're about to hear in the next segment, she represents part of Winnipeg, Manitoba, where they have trouble with smuggling because it is nearly impossible to search the rail cars that come in from the United States because of lack of manpower. What can be done about that to ensure that customs and shipments are searched and contraband is seized? When you have an area where, as described by this MP, 1/millionth of the rail cards can actually be searched and 1 millionth of the contraband can be seized because of those searches, that sounds pretty ineffective, and something needs to be done to make enforcement effective, to make penalties effective, and thus making safety a top priority. So let's listen to today's Policy and Rights as we begin with the MP from Winnipeg, Manitoba.
I'll just say a few words, and then do you want to do questions? Okay. Yeah, well, I would say that I think Canadians will be very disappointed with the result from yesterday's announcement. The Liberals made it seem yet again like they're taking real action to keep communities safe, when in fact that is not the case. This is another failed opportunity to address a very serious issue in Canada. We've consistently seen gun violent crime go up in the last 7 years that Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister. They're spending more money than any other government in history, and yet yesterday's announcement will do nothing to address the rise of gun violence in Canada.
Yeah, Ms. Dancher, in the question period, you're asking the Prime Minister of what further border measures are being implemented to try to stop illegal guns being smuggled into the United States. If you were government, what would you do to try to tamp down smuggled guns?
Oh, it's a great question. So when we recently did a guns and gangs study at Public Safety National Security Committee, and we had the CBSA Border Officer Union come forward and really outline how very strapped their resources are, much like police resources who are struggling to keep up with the calls for service of gun violence and the like. Our border agents are also struggling to keep up with demand. So, for example, they don't have enough border agents or enough technology capacity to check rail cars, for example. So millions of rail cars come into Canada every day, direct lines through the United States, right from Mexico, right into Winnipeg, where I represent, actually. And they're so strapped at the border that they can actually check 1/1,000,000th of rail cars that come into Canada. So effectively, they can't check any. So that's an area where drugs and firearms are being smuggled into Canada. I've spoke with police who also confirm this, particularly in Winnipeg, where we have that direct line. So more border agents in particular are needed, but also improved technology to be able to search and scan vehicles that are coming in as well.
Yeah, you have to get to the CPAC panel shortly, so anything else you want to add quickly?
Great. So do I, actually. 4:30, yeah. Well, I would just say that, again, I think Canada's Conservatives in particular, but all Canadians really want to see action on gun violence. And as I outlined in question period today, there are real things that can be done to reduce gun violence that I think every party can support and all Canadians can support. And that's, again, more resources for police, guns and gangs units to tackle gun crime in our cities, which is the problem. More border security resources so we can stop the smuggling from coming in. And then also, I think we have to also plan long term. A lot of the gun violence we're seeing is coming from impoverished neighborhoods. So we need to ensure we're targeting them, supporting anti-gang and anti-criminal community grassroots organizations that help divert youth from living lives of crime. And we've consistently heard this all throughout our guns and gangs study. Experts agree, and police also agree, and we consistently heard this, that bans will not be effective because criminals who cause the gun violence in Canada don't listen to bans. So again, yesterday's announcement fell flat, and it's misleading to tell Canadians that it will have any impact on reducing gun violence in Canada.
Hopefully we give the government and not you a hard time today. Speaker, the Prime Minister is penalising Canadians at the pumps on purpose. That's because he wants to end Canada's energy sector, and so he's quite happy when gas prices soar. The fact is, a carbon tax does nothing but increase the cost of gas and everything else. But still, the Prime Minister wants it because he wants high gas prices, and he doesn't care that it's hurting Canadians. Isn't it true that Canadians paying excessively high gas prices is exactly what this Prime Minister wants?
You're right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the global pandemic and inflation caused by Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine has led to rising prices across the country and around the world. That's why we continue to be there to support families with investments in childcare, with investments in increases to the CCB, with investments in supporting our seniors and our young people. But, Mr. Speaker, when the member opposite attacks the price on pollution, she perhaps forgets that that $832 is what we send to families in Manitoba on average to support with the price of fuel.
Leader of the opposition.
Well, yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we saw Liberals engage in a game of smoke and mirrors. On one hand, they're banning handguns. On the other hand, they're pushing through Bill C-5, which tells criminals, don't worry. If you're convicted of a gun crime, you just hang out at home for your sentence. This is not keeping communities safe, and it is not reassuring to moms and dads who are worried about their kids. So, will the Prime Minister get serious about keeping vulnerable communities safe, scrap Bill C-5, and legislate tough penalties for gun criminals?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, it's absolutely true that we move forward to present legislation that once passed will make it no longer legal to buy, sell, transfer, or import handguns anywhere in Canada. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-5, the legislation does not stop police from charging people with gun offences or prosecutors from pursuing convictions. What it does do is make sure criminals face serious penalties while addressing the overrepresentation of Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system.
Hear, hear. Leader of the opposition.
I'm a mom, and I know all of us want our kids safe in their schools and in their communities. That's why I'm so frustrated with what these Liberals are doing. They're banning guns, and then when the criminals ignore their gun ban and use the guns to rob someone or commit a carjacking, the Liberals are letting these gun criminals do their time at home. How can the Prime Minister claim to be keeping people safe when he refuses to have jail time for violent criminals who ignore his useless gun bans and are hurting and terrorizing our children?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our criminal justice reform legislation turns the page on failed Conservative policies that ignored systemic racism and discrimination. What our communities need is a justice system that punishes criminals. What we don't need is a system that targets racialized people because of systemic discrimination or sends people to prison because they struggle with addiction. This bill is another step forward to create a system that is fair, effective, and keeps Canadians safe.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is that violent gun crime has only gone up under this Prime Minister. Actually, it's gone up significantly since he's formed office, and the data proves this, Mr. Speaker. He has failed to keep Canadians safe from gun violence in our cities like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and at the same time, he's been weak on violent crime, soft on criminals by allowing them to avoid jail time with bills like Bill C-5. Mr. Speaker, when will this Prime Minister drop his failed approach, stop putting our communities at risk, and go after dangerous criminals with guns?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, over the past 7 years, we've continually moved forward on strengthening gun control in this country. And that's exactly what we announced yesterday, making it no longer legal, as of the passage of that legislation, to buy, sell, import, or transfer handguns in Canada. On top of that, the assault weapon ban that we brought in place 2 years ago is going to be matched with a mandatory buyback. These are measures that are going to keep our communities safe, measures the Conservatives vote against because they're against gun control.
Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is misleading Canadians. Bill C-5 and the other measures by this Liberal government are failing to keep our communities safe. They are putting them at risk. If they wanted to stop gun violence, they'd put more resources to border agents to stop gun smuggling. They'd put more resources to police to stop violent criminals with guns. They'd put more resources for anti-gang community groups to divert youth from a life of crime. That's how you stop gun violence, not useless gun bans or bills like Bill C-21 that will do nothing to stop gun violence in this country. Isn't that right, Mr. Speaker?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
While Conservative members parrot talking points from the gun lobby, we will continue to act on keeping Canadians safe. That's exactly what we've continued to do over the past many years and what we continue to move forward with on stronger gun control, while at the same time we do invest in communities, while we do invest in more tools for CBSA and RCMP to interdict guns at the border. Indeed, over the past year, we interdicted twice as many guns as we had the year before. Our plan is working, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to keep Canadians safe.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, You have clearly exhausted my colleague for Joliette, but I am still very happy that you are back. However, the Minister of Justice and the Prime Minister have clearly expressed that they plan to go to the Supreme Court against Bill 21 and Bill 96, which in itself is an extension of Bill 101. So ultimately, the government will be bringing the debate onto friendly territory with a predictable result. And how can we explain all that? Well, the real question for the Prime Minister is the following. Is English really threatened in Quebec? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, with regard to Bill 21, we are on the side of Quebecers who are shocked and disappointed that a young teacher can no longer practice her profession. We support Quebecers who are defending their rights in the courts. With regard to this legislation that they find unjust, we expect this matter to be appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, and if that occurs, our government is determined to contribute to the debate, given the broad implications for all Canadians throughout the country, and the necessity of defending the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Contributing to the debate means cash, and also perpetuating a real lie. Because we need to stop telling this lie, this partisan lie about non-practicable jobs. Ultimately, the Quebec language and secularism is being attacked, and that's actually now what all of the Conservative leadership candidates are doing. The basis to all this, and this question was not answered, is English threatened in Quebec? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we all agree that French is threatened throughout the country, and therefore we are here to protect French not just in Quebec, but also in official language minority communities outside Quebec. And in order to be consistent, in order to protect minority French communities outside Quebec, we also need to be there to protect minority Anglophone communities inside Quebec. We are consistent in our approach. We will always be there to defend minorities throughout the country. That's why we have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, we just learned that the government approved BC's request to decriminalize small quantities of drugs. It took them 27,000 overdose deaths over 6 years until they finally saw reason. But there are also families who are mourning their loved ones in other provinces. My colleague for Courtenay Alberni has proposed a bill which will be voted on tomorrow, which takes a public health approach. Will this government stop playing games with people's lives and vote in favor of that legislation tomorrow? It's a question of life and death. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the opioid crisis has hit families and communities hard. We have lost many to an overdose. Our approach follows up on other measures that we took previously to fight the opioid crisis, including investments of over $800 million in community-led projects to reduce risks and for treatment and prevention. We also recently approved BC's request to remove penalties on possession of small amounts of drugs in the province, and we will continue to collaborate with all provinces and territories in the country to save lives and end the crisis.
Bernie.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has finally approved British Columbia's request to decriminalize simple possession of controlled substances after dragging its feet for months. This is an important step to stop the harms of failed drug policy. But we're dealing with a national crisis. There are thousands of families burying their loved ones outside of BC. Provincial and local governments shouldn't have to fill the void of federal leadership. Lives are at stake. A patchwork approach is completely irresponsible. Will this government save lives by supporting my bill tomorrow for a national health-based approach to substance use?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes that problematic substance use is a public health issue, and we are working with partners to advance a multifaceted health-based strategy to end the overdose and toxic drug supply crisis. That is why we've approved the BC proposal to decriminalize personal possession of small amounts of certain certain illegal drugs within the province. There is, of course, more to do, and we're taking action with a range of provinces and territories, as well as other partners, to end this ongoing tragedy. We know that we need to move forward on proper supports, and that's what we're doing with BC, and we look forward to talking with other provinces about that as well.
The honourable member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, when the government is asked about inflation and the cost of living, it continually downplays the real struggle of Canadians that they face while referring to the strength of the economy. But now reports confirm what Canadians are feeling. In March, the economy grew by just 0.7%. In April, the economy nearly stalled, and inflation is at 30-year highs. Mr. Speaker, so what does the Minister of Finance have to say to the Canadians that are struggling with inflation and now facing a slowing economy? Is relief on the way?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have to urge a little bit of economic literacy on the members opposite. The reality is, in data released today, the Canadian economy grew by 3.1% on an annualized basis in the first quarter of this year. Mr. Speaker, that is the highest growth rate in the G7, a very impressive performance. And I want to thank Canadians for their hard work that leads to that strength of our economy.
The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, has the minister seen the price of gasoline lately? Well, of course not. She's got a chauffeur. But in Vancouver, it's as high as $2.35 per liter. A huge chunk of that cost is GST and the carbon tax. In fact, it's a tax on a tax. Conservatives have asked the Prime Minister to suspend GST on gasoline purchases. He refused. The only winner is this Liberal government, which is raking in billions in extra taxes, but is refusing to share that windfall with Canadian families. Why has this Prime Minister and this government so badly failed Canadians in their time of need?
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have tremendous respect for the member for Abbotsford, but I must say that his economic analysis here is just off. The reality is a price on pollution is the most effective way to fight climate change. The IMF, among others, has recognized the Canadian approach as an international model. And Mr. Speaker, that money goes back directly to Canadians. Ontario, where I'm an MP, a family of four will get $745 back. In Alberta, more than $1,000.
The honourable member for Battleford's Lloydminster.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with that answer, I would suggest, and it sounds like that the minister isn't speaking to Canadians whatsoever. Gas prices are hitting record levels, and Canadians are struggling to fill their tanks. The Prime Minister likes to point the finger elsewhere. The reality is that taxes on fuel are lining his government's pockets on the backs of hardworking Canadians. The latest carbon tax hike could not have come at a worse time and is even more punishing for constituents like mine who live in rural Canada. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister offer Canadians some much-needed relief and finally abandon his failed carbon tax?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the question because it gives me an opportunity to remind members of the fact that the price on pollution goes back directly to Canadian families. A family of four in Saskatchewan, for example, will get $1,100 back. In Alberta, $1,079. Manitoba, $832. And Ontario, which I represent, $745. That is real money back in the pockets of Canadian families, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives care about Canadian creators, but the Liberals continue to ignore the negative impacts of C11. This morning, digital creator and 47-year-old skateboarding mom, Orby Roy, told this to the committee. Not only does this bill not help me, it hurts me and actively undermines my needs. Wow. I have never gotten a seat at the table, except now as a digital creator, I'm getting a seat at the table. Representation matters. Please don't suppress my voice, end quote. Mr. Speaker, will the government do the right thing and fully exempt user-generated content and remove Section 4.2 from Bill C-11?
The Honourable Minister for Canadian Heritage.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about representation. Yesterday, we heard a troubling revelation at committee. Our organization dedicated to opposing Bill C-11 admitted that it was paid by YouTube and TikTok, but they claim to represent exactly that, digital creators saying they're grassroots. That's called astroturfing. And of course, this was never, ever revealed before. And it raises serious question, Mr. Speaker. Did the Conservatives know this when they invited that organization?
Member for Perth Wellington.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what Conservatives know is that we will always stand up for our creative industries and fight on their behalf so we can see Canadian creators succeed here at home and around the globe. Yesterday at committee, communications expert Monica Auer said gaps in C-11 will make current serious problems with CRTC's transparency, accountability, and timing even worse. Court challenges of its implementation by CRTC will create long delays and cost Canada and those working in its creative sectors quite dearly. Mr. Speaker, will the government stand up for new creative industries and admit that their strategy is flawed and fully exempt user-generated content?
Honourable Minister.
We are, Mr. Speaker, standing up for them. We are, like we're standing up for other cultures workers, for our producers, for our actors, for our technicians, something they can't do. They cannot say, yes, we're going to support Bill C-11 because it's important to tell our stories, because it's important for music, because it's important for television. They never said that, and they never will, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member, l'Honourable Député de Richmond-Arthabasca.
The Honourable Member for Richmond-Arthabasca. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals claim that user-generated content in C-11 will be exempted from regulation. But it is clearly written that the CRTC could regulate any content that generates direct or indirect revenue. That means that almost all content could be regulated, which is something that experts are concerned about. Can the Minister clearly tell us that all user-generated content will be exempted? Yes or no? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear from day one. Platforms will have obligations, not users. Platforms are in, users are out. It's been clear from the very beginning. My question, and I have a lot of respect for my colleague, but he's from Quebec, and he knows how important this bill is for Quebec. And yet, for some reason, he's refusing to support the government in its efforts to support the French language and Quebec culture. I'm surprised and disappointed. The Honourable Member for Avignon, Lamitis, Matane, Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, the firearms bill is progress, and the Bloc Québécois will be working with the Minister to improve it. But nothing has been fixed. Assault weapons have not been banned. And the mandatory buyback program is still just a promise. It's not in the bill. There's also the problem of there being a lack of a precise definition of what an assault weapon is, which means that new models could be created that get around the restrictions. If C-21 was adopted today, assault weapons would remain in circulation. Does the Minister agree that we need to correct these problems? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to thank my colleague for her offer to work together on Bill C-21. It represents a significant step forward in our agenda to fight firearms violence. Now, on the issues my colleague raised about mandatory buyback, for example, we will be taking concrete next steps immediately to be sure that we bring these assault weapons back out of communities. That's the right thing to do. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Avignon, Lamitis, Matane, Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, let's not forget that C-21 does not sufficiently address the heart of the problem that we have in Quebec currently, which is illegal weapons. Illegal firearms crossing the border that end up in the hands of organized criminals and that are not being dealt with at all. There will be no kind of freeze or buyback for those weapons. Mr. Speaker, 2022 is shaping up to be the most violent year in the recent history of Montreal. Can the Minister really guarantee that the measures in C-21 will be enough to turn around that trend? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, my colleague has had a chance, or when my colleague has had a chance to read the bill, she will have seen that there are many increased sanctions for organized crime and criminals who want to traffic weapons across borders. That is exactly why we have added resources for border services and the RCMP to reduce or end firearms smuggling. We have already taken measures, but we need to go further, and that's what we're going to do. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Prime Minister said that the shooting outside a childcare center in Montreal convinced him to table C-21. But that bill would not have prevented that shooting. I don't think so, because criminal gangs are not targeted by the bill. And yet, it is criminal gangs that are at the heart of illegal firearms trafficking. And that's what's leading to the wave of shootings in Montreal. Will the minister finally create a register of criminal organizations to help our police forces arrest members of recognized gangs? The Minister of Public Safety. I completely agree with my colleague, Mr. Speaker. It's unacceptable when there are tragedies caused by shootings. These are tragedies, and that's exactly why we are introducing this bill. This bill will attack criminals, those who are causing these tragedies. There will be new provisions like an increase in punishment for criminals, an increase in resources for police forces. We will be working with the Bloc Québécois and all members in this House.
Member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Send your complaints to your MP. That's the proposed solution to the outrageous passport delays by the Minister of Families and Children and Social Development. Canadians expect service from Service Canada, yet we know that 11 of 35 passport offices have chronic lineup problems. People are waiting for hours on hold and often get disconnected after waiting. This is not service. This lack of accountability and lack of preparation is unacceptable. When will the minister stop telling Canadians they are doing a great job and actually acknowledge the severity of this issue and serve Canadians?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, we have acknowledged that this is a challenge since the beginning, that these volumes are unprecedented, that we have passports that are up for renewal this year as well as from the past 2 years, plus additional passports for people who've never requested them before. But unlike the Conservatives, if a constituent has a challenge and needs support for an urgent passport, please contact their MP so that we can ensure that they get the help they need, particularly when travel is urgent. And so I am sure that all members in this House would like to help those urgent cases get their passport. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Mr. Speaker, my office has been inundated with emails from constituents feeling frustrated by passport delays. Now we're hearing countless stories about missed trips, extra costs, and hour-long wait times. Passport Canada's website still says it only takes 2 weeks to process an application, but we know countless number of people who applied back in March that still are being told not to book summer travel. The system is failing. What is this minister doing to fix these unacceptable delays?
The Honourable Minister of Families.
And let me just clarify for the member, because when you read the website, it is 10-day processing for in-person services at a specialized passport office, and 96% of applicants are getting their passports within less than 10 days when they go to a specialized passport office. The challenge is in the mail system, and as I've explained to this House before, pre-pandemic, 80% of applicants happened in person. Now that's the reverse. We are working hard to address this issue, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do everything we can to make this process as smooth as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's quite out of touch for the ministers to suggest people should just wait in line in these overnight lines to get their passports. I spoke to Jana in my riding. She has 2 children under 5. She can't bring them with her to wait overnight in line. She applied in March. Her credit card was charged on April 20th. She had to cancel a trip that was supposed to take place on June 13th. She still hasn't gotten her passport. She's rebooked for the end of June, and she's still waiting and she can't get a response. What is the minister prepared to do to help Jana and those like her get their passport and not have to cancel their trip a second time?
Honourable Minister of Families.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage that Member of Parliament to reach out to my office. Everyone who has done that, we've been able to ensure that their passport is received in time. We are experiencing challenges, but we will continue to do everything we can to address these challenges. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm just going to ask if you can keep it down. I'm having a hard time hearing the minister. I've got magnification here with speakers behind me. It's still not enough.
The Honourable Member from Montmagny, Lille, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, wait times for processing passport applications are ridiculous. Imagine, last week, there were people who went to the passport office with their camping chairs. People don't want to spend their vacation at the passport office. They want to spend their vacation somewhere nice in the world. So the solution is very easy. All we have to do is allow employees to go back in person to the office. So when is this going to happen with Service Canada, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that it's very frustrating for Canadians because over the past 2 years, people have followed directives, they've stayed home, and now they want to travel. And they're everywhere in the world. For example, the UK, the US, Sweden, France. They have delays of from 9 to 11 weeks. And that's something that is happening the world over. But still, we are putting in additional resources to ensure that we can fix this situation. But it's going to last because there's an enormous volume. Thank you.
Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, today's Auditor General's report confirms Canadian veterans are still waiting months or even years to access disability benefits and says better data is desperately needed. This has been an issue since 2014, but the government continues to fail Canadian veterans. It's completely unacceptable that veterans are forced to do without the supports and services they need because this government hasn't fixed the problems. It's been 8 years. What will it take for the minister to finally get Canadian veterans the help they deserve?
Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate my honourable colleague's question. I thank the Auditor General for her work and welcome her 4 recommendations. Our investment of $340 million has allowed us to hire hundreds of staff and speed up processing. With that, we have reduced the backlog by 50%, from 23,000 down to just over 10,600. We're on the right path, and we will continue on the path to make sure veterans receive their appropriate remuneration.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, veterans need the government to get down that path a lot sooner. Today, the Auditor General also said that Canadians in the middle of a cost of living crisis aren't able to access the supports Liberals say are available to them. He made it clear that for these vulnerable Canadians, the government doesn't even have a plan to help. A plan would look like supporting a motion to make profitable oil and gas companies pay their fair share instead of voting against it. A plan would look like raising the GST rebate and declaring a low-income CERB repayment amnesty instead of trying to collect debt from the poor. So when will we see a real plan from this government that includes the relief people need to feed their families and keep a roof over their heads?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we welcome and accept the report from the Auditor General today. We have an initiative called Reaching All Canadians to try and ensure that Canadians have access to the benefits that they are eligible for. We have been working with third-party organizations to ensure that those that are eligible for benefits like the Canada Child Benefit, Old Age Security, the Guaranteed Income Supplement, know that they can access them and they have support in applying. We'll continue to do more as we know that we want to reach every single Canadian who is eligible, and we'll keep doing that work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that the skilled trades are at the centre of Canada's economic recovery. That's why this government is investing nearly $1 billion annually to support apprentices. I think of smart investments like the Union Training and Innovation Program, which helps kickstart lucrative careers in well-respected trades, including for Canadians from underrepresented groups. Yesterday, I was privileged to have witnessed the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion announce the launch of the new federal apprenticeship service in Halifax. Can the Minister please share with this House and all Canadians the importance of this initiative?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to my honourable colleague for her important question. Skilled trade workers are essential to Canada's economy, infrastructure, and to our everyday life. To ensure Canadians can seize the opportunities in the trades, we're helping create 25,000 new apprenticeships across Canada. We're investing $247 million to help small and medium-sized businesses hire mechanics, electricians, and other apprentices. We're also doubling incentives for employers who hire persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and other marginalized Canadians. We'll keep working with unions and business to build a strong, skilled workforce for the future.
The Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, our country's housing crisis is at a critical point. This impacts everyone, including our soldiers. Recently, a senior BC officer told soldiers that they should go to Habitat for Humanity for assistance. These are people who are prepared to lay down their lives for our freedom, and they are told to go to charity. Shameful. When will this government provide adequate housing for our soldiers who are prepared to lay down their lives for our freedoms?
The Honourable Minister of Defence.
Mr. Speaker, military members and their families are our top priority, and we are investing $445 million over the coming years to tackle this very important issue that the honourable member raised. In February 2021, we increased military members' rates of pay to ensure alignment with increases received by the Federal Public Service. We also implemented an interim relocation policy to enable remote work options and to facilitate flexibility for members. Mr. Speaker, we have more work to do. We will continue to seek ways to support our members and their families. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, Top Gun Maverick came out this week, but Canadian military families are not feeling the need for speed when it comes to getting military housing. They've lost that loving feeling that families of four are being made to sleep in single PMQs. Mr. Speaker, the hard deck for building homes is 6,000 homes needed for our military families, given the great ball of fire that is also the housing crisis, which is on a highway to the danger zone. When will the government be a wingman and build homes for Canadian military families?
The Honourable Minister of Defence.
Mr. Speaker, in all seriousness, we will continue to support our Canadian Armed Forces posted across the country and their families. For example, the post-living differential allowance is intended to help reduce financial burdens for Canadian Armed Forces personnel and their families, and to ensure that the PLD allowance effectively supports CAF members and their families and addresses affordability concerns. The Department of National Defence is reviewing the policy as we speak. We will always seek to support the people who served our country with robust compensation and with a benefits framework that works for everyone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member for Caribou, Prince George.
You know, Mr. Speaker, this minister needs to look up from her talking points. These are people, men and women, that we've asked to serve our country at home and abroad. And unbelievably, they are being asked to go to Habitat for Humanity for accommodations. They have failed to provide our troops with equipment that they need. They have failed to protect our troops from sexual misconduct. And now they have failed to ensure our troops have a place to live. This is an absolute disgrace, and this minister needs to answer for it.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that I have military members and their families as my top priority. From day one, as stated in my mandate letter, I have continued to commit to ensuring that our members have the support and resources that they need. That is why we are increasing our defense spending by 70% over a 9-year period beginning in 2017. That is why we committed another $8 billion in defense spending. That is why $6.1 billion of that will go to the needs of the military, and we will keep working on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Military personnel sacrificed to serve our country. They knew they would be moved, but they didn't expect that they would not be able to afford to live because their government would let them down. There should be some expectation of a similar cost of living when military personnel are posted from base to base. However, that's not the case with the rates of military housing varying widely across the country. The rates at Bagotville are almost double those at Cold Lake. Both are Air Force bases that are home to our CF-18s. When will the minister address this housing inequity?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to put forward a few facts. After significant cuts made by the previous Conservative government, we actually are delivering results for our Canadian Armed Forces members and their families. Tax-free income for members to...
I'm gonna ask the minister just to stop for a second.
That was terrible.
I think everybody wants to hear the answer to that question, and especially the honourable member for Fort Murray Cold Lake. So maybe we'll let the minister start from the top so that everyone can hear the answer. The Honourable Minister for Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I'll try this again. Thank you. After significant cuts made by the previous Conservative government, we are delivering results for our Canadian Armed Forces. Some of these results, Mr. Speaker, tax-free income for members deployed on international operations, close to $200 million to improve access to health care and implement a joint suicide prevention strategy, $6 million per year in new funding for military family resource centers, which mean more child care hours, and enshrining a victim's Bill of Rights in the military justice system. Mr. Speaker, this is our top priority. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-les-Basques. Mr. Speaker, university research is essential to the advancement of science and greatly enriches our societies. It is vital that the recruitment process for research chairs be solely based on candidates' qualifications and the type of the research. But in the case of the CRC program, Ottawa is putting diversity over excellence. Does the minister agree that no discrimination should be used when assessing competence? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague because he's allowing me to speak to the investments that we've made in science. In the past years, Mr. Speaker, you have seen the importance of science, technology, and innovation to bring forward solutions to major human issues such as climate change. We've seen the importance of diversity and inclusion within scientific research, and that, Mr. Speaker, is why we expect research councils put the right policies in place to achieve that objective. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-les-Basques. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois has always advocated for research funding to be based on skill. The federal government, though, wants it to be based on diversity. But in Toronto, visible minorities account for 51% of the population, while in Rimouski it's only 2%, and yet both regions are subject to the same criteria. Mr. Speaker, our universities are doing everything in their power to recruit and represent diversity, but this needs to be realistic. Why does the government not trust universities, and why doesn't it fund scientific research according to scientific potential? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. Indeed, we trust the universities on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we've invested massively in science, research, and innovation. And we must also ensure that colleagues in this House want that the scientific community represent the diversity of Canada. That is why we ask the research councils to put the right policies in place to ensure that scientific research in Canada looks like Canadians. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Pont-Neuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, We need to act urgently in terms of the labor shortage. There are solutions, but this government has shown that it's lost control. For example, a temporary foreign worker who's been coming to Canada for 10 years still has to go through an eligibility interview. Hello? That worker's been here for 10 years. Here's another example. A manufacturer who has plants in both Ontario and Quebec needs 4 times longer to obtain a permit in Quebec, and that is not Quebec's fault. What is the problem with Immigration Canada? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and welcome back to the House, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my colleague because we know that immigration is essential to fighting our labor shortage. And we are looking for workers in certain professions, and I'd like to tell my colleague that over the first quarter of this year, we processed some 100,000 requests for work permits, which is double the number processed last year. We're going to continue to ensure that Canadian employers have access to the workers they need to ensure that we launch an excellent economic recovery in Canada and Quebec. Mr. Speaker, our economy is being adversely affected by the labor shortage. Not only are we lacking workers, but fewer and fewer people want to work. Why? Because the government has created a culture of dependency. Because the Liberals aren't expediting temporary foreign worker applications, when will this government put in place work incentives? The Honourable Minister. This is important to ensure our food security, especially during the pandemic. We need to protect our workers, and that is why we are ensuring that workers are ready to welcome their workers safely. We make sure that the Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, Liberal inaction strikes again. It has created a vicious cycle that is without precedent for Canadian workers and businessmen who are stuck with dire situations caused by the labor shortage. This is something else that is added to the EI problems, passport problems, problems with temporary foreign workers, permanent residency, and identity theft in Canada. When finally will this Prime Minister fix his general problem of incompetence? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, listen, I'm smiling because I always appreciate these questions, and it's clear that my colleague is very passionate, and we should applaud him for that, because on this side of the House, I can assure you that our government works very closely with Quebec to ensure that workers can work. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, we doubled the number of work permits that were processed as compared to the same period last year, and we're going to continue to work hard to ensure that Canadians and Quebecers can work. The Honourable Member for Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle. Mr. Speaker, after 2 very difficult years for the tourism sector, it is high time to underscore the importance of this sector. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance, can she tell this House what the government is doing to advance this industry, which is at the heart of Canada's economy? The Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank my colleague for her question and for her very hard work. Mr. Speaker, yesterday was the beginning of National Tourism Week, and Canada is ready to welcome visitors and travelers from the world over. And I'd like to also thank Beth Potter and her association for the excellent success of her conference last week, and for her leadership at the head of our tourism sector, and for everything they do to maximize Canada's visibility on the international scene. Happy National Tourism Week.
The Honourable Member for Desanete, Mrs. Nippy Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, since 2015, the cost of living in northern Saskatchewan has skyrocketed. People travel great distances for groceries, medical appointments, and to check on loved ones. There's one charging station, no public transit, and there are more deer and moose trails than bike lanes in my riding. The cost of gas, groceries, home heating fuel, and farm inputs, nearly everything is getting more expensive under this Liberal NDP coalition. This is another attack on Saskatchewan's rural, northern, and remote communities. Isn't that true, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been taking measures in order to address the cost of living increase, which we all know is caused by the war started by Russia. Mr. Speaker, I do believe that the member opposite will find in this budget a number of measures that go directly to his point. Mr. Speaker, there is a one-time trouble finding affordable homes in our budget. Mr. Speaker, there is a proposal to subsidize dental care in our budget. Mr. Speaker, we have already reduced the taxes on middle-class families, and the Conservatives voted against it. Will they vote for our budget?
The Honourable Member for Peace River Westlaw.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the topic of Russia, we know that during the war and conflict, women and youth are at increased risk of exploitation. The 2021 U.S. Trafficking in Person report notes that the Ukraine has been a long-time source country for human trafficking victims. Now that millions of women and youth are fleeing Ukraine, we know that human traffickers have been targeting them. What specific steps is this government taking to ensure that Ukrainian women and youth seeking refuge in Canada are not being trafficked and exploited? Good question.
The Honourable The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you to my colleague for his important question. Indeed, the question of human trafficking is an issue, and indeed, this is something that we've raised through the G7. Many of the G7 ministers have made clear that we need to do more to counter any form of human trafficking, particularly in the context of Putin's war of choice against Ukraine. I look forward working with my colleague on this issue and with many others within Cabinet, because we need to give particular attention to this issue. Thank you.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.